The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome back. We're up to topic 2 in our discussion on Scrum versus Lean in Agile project management. Hoping everyone's well. Thanks for tuning in and for joining in tonight. We do of course have plans to discuss a focus on Scrum this evening, but I thought I'd just put up the results of the poll that many of you have had a chance to comment on during the pre-webinar discussion time. So there's an answer there. For those of you who had a view and were curious as to what other people seem to think about the depth of what Scrum offers, there's a little bit of information and insight for you all. Now we're going to kick off tonight with the usual housekeeping. Let me just activate the presentation information. Now, first of all, the housekeeping things to go over. As we did last time, of course, the questions box, just a reminder for anyone who's interested, use the questions box for any questions that you have or think of during the session tonight. We are keeping a list of any questions that we don't answer. The plan, of course, is that we will answer questions at different points and spend a bit of time at the end answering any questions that have come up towards the end. So just throw them in there as you think of them as you go. No need to save them for the end. Put them up there. If you have any admin questions or back-end process questions, put them up, and we do have James who will be answering a lot of those by text directly for everyone. And do have a look if you have a question that you think might have been answered. It's possible that someone else has already put that question up there. So look at the answered questions and see if that gives you any information that what you might be looking for. We are, of course, planning that after session 3, we will have a summary of any list of unanswered questions that we might not have been able to get to, and we'll put together, if we need to, a separate compilation of those. And now I want to remind everyone of the online course portal. Those of you who haven't had a chance to log in there yet, that's where you'll find all of the information regarding this particular course. It gives the pre-recorded audio files, which are an integral part of the content for this. There's something that we encourage you to have a listen to, especially prior to each webinar if you can, if you get the time. They're only brief, they're only sort of 15 to 20 minutes each, and there's only 3 of them. So those are part of the content that will be assessed. And naturally we also put recordings of the webinars up there, so if you do miss this or you want to repeat any of the information we've covered, then we'll be putting that up in there each week as we go. You'll also find the forums available there. That's where you'll have discussions, and there already are some discussions in there, people that have been contributing and asking questions and chatting and commenting, etc., which is great to see. So if you do have questions that you do want to have discussed and we haven't given an answer to in the webinars, the forum is a great place to put your question and get answers from different sources rather than just from myself. As I mentioned, the webinars, these are recorded, and these recordings are uploaded, so you'll have access to them right through the course. There is, of course, a little bit of study guide information. We've put up there for each topic just a few poignant questions and a few considerations to think about that might help shape your thinking and your investigation into each topic, just to give you some pointers on the sorts of things you might want to be thinking about and having answers to for yourself as you go. And I've already mentioned the pre-recorded audio lectures that are up there, quite useful, and they form a foundation of what we talk about each week. And although we do talk about the same sort of thing in the webinar, we also try not to completely replace and repeat what was covered in the pre-recorded. So they do serve as a combination in the content we cover. There's the URL, the information that the portal where you'll find all that stuff. The login that you'll need for that is what you would have been sent via the original, after the original enrollment process. There is, of course, a link you can follow if you don't have that or can't find your login. There is a resend password link you can use, of course, to get access to that. Now, tonight, as I promised last week, we are being joined by Jason Howarth, who's the course director at the School of Computing and Mathematics at Charles Sturt University. I'll hand over to him now, and he'll be able to give you a bit more insight and a bit more background about CSU and what their role is with this and other things, so hopefully give you a bit of insight on how that works. Jason, let me hand over to you and let you have your discussion. Thanks for joining, Jason.
Thanks, Brenton, and welcome along, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So, yes, I'm a course director at Charles Sturt. I'm responsible for the administration and general coordination of all of our computing courses here at Charles Sturt University, and just wanted to briefly talk to you about the subject or the course that you're studying now and how it actually sort of segues into a couple of courses that we run at Charles Sturt University. So the short course that Brenton is delivering is actually part of a subject that we run here at CSU. Brenton, coincidentally, is the lecturer for that subject, called ITE 518 Agile Project Management. And that's part of our Master of Project Management and Master of Management IT programs. So we might just move the slide over, and I'll just want to talk briefly about the Master of Project Management, which is a course that we run and possibly of interest to some of you. A fully accredited master's degree consisting of 12 subjects. As you can see on the left of the screen there, it consists of 7 core subjects as well as some electives. ITE 518, on which this short course is based, is one of the industry electives for that program. Now, a couple of interesting things about this master's. One is that there is a pathway into the masters for those of you who don't have an undergraduate degree on the basis of work experience, of industry work experience. So if you're worrying that you don't have an undergraduate degree but you do have considerable experience in industry, please get in touch with us because we do offer a pathway into the masters on that basis. The other interesting fact is that we offer credit in this masters on the basis of industry certification. So you can see down the bottom there that if you do hold the PMP certificate, we'll give you credit for 1 subject into the Masters. Similarly, for the Prince 2 certification, credit for a subject. And obviously, if you hold any Agile certification, you potentially could get credit for the Agile software development subject as well. So plenty of stuff to interest people there. A lot of industry focus in the subjects, and very much a relevant degree for those of you practicing project management. If you do want to find out more about if you're entitled to any credit, you can actually go to www.itmasters.edu.au and actually find out whether you're eligible to enter the program and how much credit you might be awarded for that. So who is Charles Sturt? Just briefly want to talk about our position in the marketplace. So if we just move the slide over one more time, we can see where Charles Sturt is in relation to other universities in the online space. So just have to maximise our slides
my
there.
presentation has been missed around. Hang on a second.
You're right. So yeah, please feel free, if you do have any questions about the Masters, to contact me, jhowarth@csu.edu.au. You can also go to the IT Masters website, and there's plenty of contact details there as well. Only too happy to hear from people. We do have an intake in session 3. The Masters runs in 3 sessions per year. Studying at the part-time rate of the recommended rate of 2 subjects a session, you could actually complete the Masters in 2 years. So just looking at the slide there in terms of market leadership of distance education, you can see Charles Sturt University is the leader on the right-hand side. So I guess I neglected to mention that these Masters programs are all delivered online, so there's no need to visit the campus. They are designed for people who are working. So the whole Masters can be completed online and part-time. And one of the other good features of the Masters is you get online lectures such as this one. So you're not just left to read a book. You do get lots of interaction from the lecturer. So yes, Charles Sturt is the leader in distance education in terms of the number of students we enrol. So we are very experienced in that area. We do have a lot of experience delivering quality online subjects. If you look also at the IT numbers in Australia in terms of postgraduate, which basically means master's programs, who's the leader in enrolments within the Australian sector? Once again, it's Charles Sturt. So for master's enrolments within Australia in the IT area, we're well ahead of competitors such as University of Technology Sydney or UTS, and big players like RMIT and Monash. So we know what we're doing, we're good at what we do, and we're very proud of these industry-focused programs. So look, I'll hand back to Brenton. Don't want to take too much more of your time, but if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch or visit the IT Masters website. So thank you.
Thanks very much for that info, Jason. And some of you might have had some questions about the background of CSU. Hopefully we might have answered a couple of those. Obviously, if you have more questions, just follow the links that we've got. There's also a link on the portal that will take you to the page that talks about the Masters of Project Management program. So that will give you more information and some links to follow there. And, of course, the link to apply to check your eligibility based on your existing industry experience, etc. So that's where you'll find more information on that. All right, well, we've got some interesting topic stuff to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about Scrum in particular, but as I mentioned before, we're not going to look to repeat all the things that we covered in the pre-recorded audio, but we are going to talk a bit about why and how Scrum works the way it does. And we want to try and pull out of this an awareness of what are the key forces that have created the kind of thing that Scrum has become today. So what's contributing to it? And the key point I want to start with and talk about is the idea of iterations. The concept of a cycle. And again, just pulling a definition off the internet, we've found various definitions of iteration that all say the same sort of thing. It's essentially a repetition, an instance of repeating something. Now, in the concept of project management, when you talk to traditional project management people who are used to getting everything right up front, planning everything ahead of time, and they don't want to repeat anything. So the original concept, the traditional concept of repetition is something of an anathema to project management. But what this meant, it was such an anathema to it. It was so alien to the idea of planning everything up front, to have to repeat anything. It meant that those unique situations that came about that couldn't be completely planned up front, they really had very little to lean on in order to solve those sorts of problems and deal with those sorts of challenges. Well, the first question that comes up from this is, well, why might we need to repeat anything? Surely, in the simplest terms, a repetition of something must be considered a waste, or at least a potential waste of energy and effort. Why would we do it again? Well, we're not really saying here that you do the exact same thing again. What we're saying is that you repeat a sequence of events. You cyclically produce a new result, a better result. You incrementally improve by the fact that you're repeating a set of steps. Now, what this repetition does is it creates an opportunity to have this pause, this specifically structured gap in between these cycles of activity. And exactly how Scrum does that, we're going to talk about in a few moments. But the benefit or the point of repeating anything is that if you repeat a set of steps, you are forced to have a moment in between where you stop and reflect, where you review and examine. Because the whole point about being able to repeat something is to do it better next time, or to get a better result, or to get incremental improvement out of the next process or the next cycle. So the whole concept of using this in projects is for when you do have the sense of the unknown, the uncertain, the exploration, the discovery that we talked about last week. And we need a way of structurally handling the fact that we're going to gain some information, and we want to be using that information as quickly and as effectively as we can. And the contrast with traditional plan-based project management is that in the plan-based model, you want to figure everything out up front and make all the decisions up front. The repetition model means that you have specifically structured points throughout your project that you make your decisions within. Now, not all the decisions. There are a certain number of decisions that you need to make in the beginning, but it's just enough to get you started. And in the Scrum model, we have the sprint process, which we're about to elaborate on, that is our period of cycle or period of activity that we work through. So iterations are a foundation principle in the Scrum methodology. It's a period of time that we work through that says we're going to get something done, and then we're going to stop and look and see what we've learned from that and how we can leverage what we've learned. Now, one of our more famous philosophers, Plato, put forward in, and as you can see it's somewhat loose translation out of Latin, but his comment here is that he said, "Twice and thrice over, as they say, good is it to repeat and review what is good." Now, I've talked already about the idea of saying We look for things that we learn. We look for discovery. We've talked about exploration, and we've talked about having these cycle periods or iterations to enable us to capture some new knowledge, some discovery, and then leverage it and use it. But there's another side to this as well, because for every review of our period of time that we look back and say, well, you know, this bit we discovered and this bit wasn't good enough and this bit we have to improve. But you know what? This, and this, it's working. That's good. That's useful. That's locked in. We're happy with that. That's also extremely useful because that's stuff that doesn't have to be done again. That's stuff that is confirmed as being effective and of value. Now, obviously how we handle these next iterations that follow are going to depend upon how much of what we've created is considered good and effective and how much of it is considered something we need to do again. Let's look at the cyclic process from a strictly agile point of view in how the cycle, it's only 3 steps in the cycle in the iteration. And yes, when we're talking about an iteration, we are talking about fundamentally a sprint from a Scrum point of view. Now these 3 words happen in sequence. The speculate is the planning phase for each iteration or each sprint. Speculate phase is where we decide what we're going to do. And we call it speculate because we're acknowledging the inherent fact that we're not sure of how everything is going to pan out. And we're speculating that if we do this activity, we will get at the end of our iteration or at the end of our sprint, we will get the outcome that we're hoping for or that we're looking for. Now, the exploration is where we actually do the work. This is where we knuckle down and actually produce what it is we think we're going to get based on our speculation. So that's the working phase, the activity phase. That is the working period of the sprint. The speculate is the sprint planning. So if we've planned by speculation and we've explored, we've built and created and learned through that process, then the key part, we must adapt. We must take on board what has come out of the exploration phase, what's come out of the work that's been done, and we must allow that to thoroughly and effectively shape what we do next, which comes back to the speculate phase. Now, if you're wondering how this process of iteration fits in with the entire concept of the project from a Scrum point of view, well, it is preceded by the envision process. Now, I mentioned a little moment ago that before we can begin our first sprint, we need some idea of the end game or the final goal or the final delivery. So the envisage phase, where we envision what's going on, is the point where we say, this is what we think we need to do from a high-level, holistic perspective. We then break that down into smaller and smaller pieces in a process that we'll talk about in a moment. And of course, once we've got to a period where we've had iteration after iteration or sprint after sprint, and we've done this enough, we have created something that can then be closed off. We can tie a bow around it and call it done. That doesn't mean that that's everything. It means that it's a body of work, an accumulated body of value that can then be segmented from anything else. It can be isolated from anything else. So a lot of what we're talking about is to discuss the real value of the reflection and the review process. If we don't have this working well enough, then we're not simply not following the tenets of Scrum, we're not effectively agile. And whenever you have a methodology that is meant to do very crucial things, which the reflection and review process is meant to do, if we undercook that, then in the waterfall traditional project management comparison, that's a bit like undercooking your schedule planning or undercooking your resource planning. Now, you know that from that perspective, if you underdo your resource planning, then you're going to have risks that come out of that because you will discover something that you didn't plan for. Similarly, we don't do the reflection and review, we're not doing the project methodology. Now, when we're doing this with a group of people, I mean, we as an individual might be able to think, okay, I can learn from what I did last month. That's pretty easy. But when you have a team collectively working towards a common goal, which is the vision of the project, you need a structure which brings alignment amongst this disparate group of people, because people are going to be working on different things. Team members are going to have different activities, different elements to what they're involved with. And even, especially in big teams, you can't have everyone knowing what everyone's doing, and that would be often inefficient. So you need a structure to ensure that the process of review and the level of collaboration and sharing of knowledge happens effectively, so that when things come out of a sprint that says, well, we learnt this didn't work so good, and we learnt this didn't go so good, but we also learnt that this was really above expectation. That needs to be shared in a structured way. The reason we make it structured is because we need it to be highly efficient in the way this information is shared. We need to ensure that the people that are using this information are not spending a great deal amount of time hunting or looking or just not looking or not even thinking about whatever came out of the previous review and reflection. So the discovery of this needs to happen in a very short period of time. It needs to be punchy, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be effective. Because one of the tenets of the Scrum methodology is we're not looking to find ways to over-administer things. We're not looking for bureaucracy. We're looking to reduce it and make sure that we're only doing what we need to do. But we need to use this knowledge. So we have a structure that says, okay, well, we're going to review, and we're going to review in a structured way so that everyone is aware, with little effort on their part, everyone's aware of what we've learnt out of that last period of activity, and now we're going to make sure that we use it because the planning of the next sprint happens immediately after the review of the last sprint. They are back to back. It's not something that happens a week later. It's something that happens immediately after, and most often in the same day, or at the very worst, the next day. But the point is, if we're not using it, then once again, we're not Agile, we're not Scrum, and we're not effective. So the repetition element of Scrum and the structured review leading to structured planning is a fundamental principle of how Scrum operates, because it's trying to make sure that we are sharing in the knowledge, we're discovering effectively, we're making sure that everyone's on the same page, and we're making sure that we learn our lessons and that we apply that learning into the next set of activity that we do. It brings up a quote that many of us have heard before, and it is a bit of a cliche, and it's often overused in many different contexts. But it says, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. And if we delve into the fundamental message behind this, we're saying that we're just wanting to make sure that we learn as we go. And the possibility of doing this in a Scrum Agile model is not only available, it's fundamental to it. And it's in contrast to what the planned methodology and waterfall approach is, which is that there are no repeats, there is no history. Yes, there might be a previous project to learn from, but all the lessons that came out of that, many of those would have been lost to uncertainty, to antiquity. They're going to be subject to the interpretation of whoever read the report and passed on the information. There's a lot of possibility for disconnect between the learning. And for those of you who've done waterfall-based projects, you'll probably would agree with me when I suggest that, in my experience, one of the most underdone things of waterfall projects is the project implementation review, the lessons learned, the discussion afterwards of, well, how could we have done that better? That's a topic that very few people are highly interested in at the end of a project, whether it's gone well or poorly. But in Scrum, it happens every month, and in some cases every couple of weeks. So the message here we're saying, and this is a quote that has been attributed to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, for those who are not familiar, is an Irish political philosopher back in the 1800s. And he is an author and had a lot to say about politics in that era. He's also accredited with another very famous saying that says that for evil to succeed, all it requires is the good men do nothing, which is another quote that many of you may have heard before. So as much as it's a cliche, it's an astute message that says that the purpose of Scrum is to learn our lessons quickly, on the spot, and use them right now. So how do we do that? Let's have a look at Scrum in a more holistic perspective. Let's look at a diagram. Here's a diagram that we've borrowed from a text, Schwaber and Bede, that talks about the whole overview of what Scrum is. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail, and we'll pull some labels out of this and see what it looks like. First of all, at the bottom left, you'll see something labeled as the product backlog. Those blue bricks that are seen there at the bottom. That, as prioritized by the product owner, that is the breakdown of the vision. The vision is, what's it all going to look like at the end? And the product backlog is, well, what are all of the components? What are all of the features? What are all of the stories that are going to be comprised to make up that vision? Now, you'll see there that the sprint backlog is one of those blocks, and those blocks are all the same size. Each one of those is another sprint waiting for its turn. So you can see here already that the product owner has already put some degree of planning into saying, well, we think these things should happen in the first sprint, and these things will probably happen in the next sprint, and these things in the third and the fourth, etc. But guess what? All that is flexible. You get to the end of your first sprint, and the opportunity, indeed the encouragement is there to say, well, look, let's rethink what we're going to put in the next sprint based on what we've just learned. So you have your sprint backlog and you follow the first green arrow. What happens? Well, the sprint backlog is comprised of a description or a study of what needs to be done from the user's perspective. And we're going to talk a little bit more about user stories in a few moments' time, or perhaps in another 20 minutes or so. So I won't delve into that now, but the point of how the sprint backlog, which is just what needs to be done in a particular sprint, it's defined in the point of view of outcomes. It's not a detailed description of what people need to do. It's the results they need to achieve. This needs to be interpreted. So part of the planning process for that particular sprint is to plan, understand, and decide how things are going to be delivered. You have a set of outcomes, then there are going to be technical and practical steps that capable and experienced and professional people need to decide what needs to be done. How do you achieve this? If you look at it from a software design point of view, and one of the features in the backlog might be the ability to report on last year's sales figures. Well, that's going to translate into database code, it's going to translate into scripts for searching, it's going to translate into some GUI. This is all the technical coding stuff, but that's not how a sprint backlog is going to be initially defined. But that's how the software coders need to work. So that understanding of what it's actually going to take, that's part of the sprint planning. Now you've got this loop that occurs here that says 30 days. Now that's a bit of an arbitrary figure. Sprints have a duration depending upon what their project deems to be appropriate. It could be 30 days, could be 2 weeks, could be 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It's usually in that period. But you've got above that something called a daily Scrum meeting. Now, I've already harped on to great extent about the point of the review process. Scrum doesn't miss any opportunity to review what's going on. So Scrum is now saying, well, every day we're going to have a mini review of what's happening. We're going to stand up for a few minutes, perhaps 15, perhaps 20, maybe 30, and we're going to have a quick chat about what's going on. And this is a very narrow perspective review that says what happened yesterday and what's going to happen today and what are the obstacles to that. So we're reviewing what's going on in Scrum at every single opportunity. Part of the purpose of this means that there's really no opportunity for a problem, an obstacle, an issue of any kind to live and grow and fester and turn into a big, ugly, hairy beast that eats our project budget. That is what this methodology is trying very hard to prevent. And the reason for that is because we're going down a project where we don't know where these hairy beasts might live in our project, or where one might appear at any moment. We've got to be pretty clear on where it's coming from and when it happens, and ready to do something about it today. Not next week, not next month, today. And if we can't fix it today, then next month or the next sprint, we definitely need to have an answer to that problem. And at the end, out the right-hand side, you see something labeled as a potentially shippable product increment. This is the outcomes that we talked about. This is something that is measured and assessed by the client, the recipient, the user, as valuable to them. It's shippable, meaning that it can be moved out into a production environment. It can start to be used, ideally. Now, admittedly, there's not every feature is going to be able to be moved out into a situation. Sometimes, some features might work in a standalone situation, but they're still really dependent upon things that are going to happen in the next sprint before they're fully viable. But as a standalone feature, capability, or user story, they are complete and they are testable and they work. If they're not complete, they don't get included in the review. They go back into the product backlog to get finished in the next sprint. Because if they're not complete, we can't assess them. We can't measure them. Now, we talk about the periods of time here, and Scrum puts these forwards as being typical periods of time. You might have a project that is a handful, half a dozen sprints, often talked about. You might have a sprint that is between 2 for a few weeks. These are typical periods. You have a daily stand-up meeting that is measured in minutes. Is it 10 minutes or is it 60 minutes? Well, that's going to vary. There's no hard and fast rules to this, but there are intentions. You don't want your daily stand-up meeting to drag on all day and be a laborious process. You want it to be an opportunity to catch the hairy beast. So you've probably gotten the idea by now that I'm suggesting that the review element is key to the success of Scrum. And in my experience with those that are considering Scrum, using Scrum, adopting Scrum, or think they are, this is most often where the methodology fails for that particular implementation. This is where it tends to go wrong. Not being clear enough that it's all about the review and the adaptation that follows that review. It's about using it. Now, if this doesn't work out, if people aren't doing this appropriately, correctly, or sufficiently thoroughly, or in a sufficiently structured and aligned manner, it's not necessarily the problem or the fault of that particular methodology, because this methodology is saying review, review, review. This is what we're all about, and everything that goes around supporting the details that exist in the Scrum methodology are all there to support the concept that you do something and then you review it and then you make use of that review. And if it doesn't support that, it's probably questionable as to how much it belongs in something like Scrum. If it runs counter to that, it probably shouldn't be involved. So be clear when you're struggling with the implementation of these things, whether or not you're struggling with what you're trying to do or how you're trying to do it and how it's coming and what's the emphasis, what's the purpose behind all of this. Now, why and how is the review, how can it be the most crucial element? Surely there are other things that are more important, like deciding what you're going to do and managing risks and change, etc. Well, the review management concept inside Scrum is much the same and does a lot of the same tasks that scope management would do, because you're reviewing to say, well, this is what we thought we were going to do in this sprint, but our last sprint has yielded some certain results, and now we get to rethink exactly what we're going to do in the next sprint. We're using this information to do things that Waterfall would describe as scope management or scope planning. We're using it for risk planning because we're saying, well, this information has come out of our last sprint. We've got this. This is going to be a bigger piece of work than we thought because we thought it was going to be easy, and it's not. It's really big, and we're going to have to change how we go about this. And if we don't, our project might fail. It could be that significant that it eats our profit, which may or may not be a very large percentage of our available budget. So the review process is doing the function, assisting with the function of risk management. It's obviously assisting with the function of change management because at the end of the sprint, we're talking to our customer. The customer says, well, you know, I like that report, but you know what I'd really like? Now that you've shown me that, we think we can make use of another kind of report that would be really cool. Can you do that as well? Yes, 3 bags full. So what we're saying here is that a lot of the things that we're familiar with that have been compartmentalized in a waterfall methodology that says, well, risk planning is this planning, is that planning, etc. And even the big one, communications planning, which if you look at many of the surveys and studies regarding waterfall project management, they will tell you that they will tell you that communications, or the failure of communications, is one of the biggest causes of project failure in plan-based projects. Now, the review is the most intense communicative component that goes on in the Scrum methodology. This is where you have everyone involved intensely reviewing what's already happened. So if you know or work with people that are busy in Scrum-based projects, you will know by now, probably, never to ring them on the sprint planning day and sprint review day. Don't ask them to lunch. Don't ring them to see how the wife and kids are going on. Don't ask them to see how their sisters are happening, etc. It's not the right day for that, because they are going to be intensely focused on the communication that needs to take place to facilitate the degree of intense planning that's going to happen. It happens at all levels of scale. I've already talked about the fact that it happens at a daily basis, it happens at a sprint basis. There is another layer above that that we'll talk about towards the end of our discussion tonight, about the entire release plan, which looks at multiple sprints together as a larger perspective. You're still looking at it from a review point of view. Here's another favorite quote of mine from another famous fellow. And again, it's a very cliche, I'm full of cliche quotes tonight, it would seem, but it's the quote about insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Imagine if we had a methodology that said, well, you know what, we're going to do our sprint, and then it's going to go a bit wrong in a few places, and we're going to ignore that, and we're going to do that again. Yeah, we probably would be guilty of being considered insane, or at least daft. So if we're going to consider a methodology that is trying to look for up-to-the-minute information so that we can make timely decisions throughout, we've got to make sure we're leveraging it, lest someone call us slightly mad. So let's look at some roles in Scrum. There aren't very many. And for those of you who have already listened to the pre-recorded audio, you'll probably have the jump on this little section of what we talk about. Obviously, there's a team, a bunch of people, the workers, the minions, as the boss might call them. These are the people that are actually delivering stuff. These are the people that work to create value. So anyone that falls into the category of producing something is part of the team. And the team is a singular collective creature. Yes, people are individuals and we still like to remember their first names, etc. I'm not saying that we depersonalize it, but what I'm saying is that the team collectively has responsibilities as a team. Just like in football, it's the team's responsibility to win the game. Yes, each player has their different roles, their different talents, and they do different jobs within the team. But winning or losing is the entire team's responsibility. So we look at the team as a singular role. We're not trying to break the team up into a part of the team that does this and a part of the team that does that. From a methodology point of view, everyone's in the same boat. But who makes sure that that's the case? Well, there are two supervisory roles that are there to facilitate a successful functioning of the team. They're not there to control the team. They're not there to manage the team. They're there to facilitate and lead. And whilst this course is not really intended to go into details about the difference between management and leadership and the difference between controlling and facilitating, you can understand that there are some fundamental differences in the approach and the attitude and the way that's done. So the Scrum Master, it's about how things happen. And as the name and the role implies, they are the master of the methodology. Now, we talk about Scrum, and we give it a label, and we call it something, and we even write books and processes and say, this is Scrum and this isn't Scrum. Well, the first part's probably right, and the second part, maybe not so. Scrum is what you need it to be. If you're following the concepts about iteration and review and sprints and the principles involved, then you might be following a variation of Scrum. Whatever it is, the Scrum Master is responsible for making sure that it works, making sure that everyone understands it clearly enough, making sure that how it's being done is disseminated, but also making sure that how it's being done is constantly being reviewed. That's that R word again. So how it is done and how it will be done. So it's all about making sure that you never stop looking for ways to improve the methodology. So in any good Scrum project, how you are scrumming, as it were, might and should be somewhat different at the end of the project to how you did in the beginning, because at the beginning you did it based on how you thought you'd do it. Now, if you've done a dozen Scrum projects with the same team before, yeah, okay, maybe you've got a good, valid reason for saying, look, we know how to do Scrum. We'll do it this way again. Why? Because you learned before that it works for you really well. So who's the other person involved? Well, they are the product owner. And yes, there's only those 3 different roles. Now, the product owner is responsible for the value of what gets created. They're responsible for what gets done, what's actually achieved. What that translates to from our diagram that we looked at a moment ago is the product backlog. It's the translation of vision into reality, valuable reality. And for many businesses, the important point here is value that will get paid for by the customer. Usually a pretty important criteria for most projects. So the product owner is what's happening, the Scrum Master is how it's going to happen. Not very many roles. Let's have a bit more of a detailed chat about some sprints. And then we might pause for a moment and I'll just check to see if there's any key questions that have come up along the way that we can tackle. Sprints. No, it's not about running really fast. It's a period of activity defined by the outcomes and the value intended to be achieved at the end of it. It's a period that's entirely designed around the review function. So when I said before that you've got, some projects might have sprints of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, the decision is driven by how you need to review. So there are some fundamental requirements, some principles of sprints that we'll look at the moment. But the way in which the Scrum Master reviews things is that they are looking for the completion within each sprint. Is stuff getting finished? Or, does Fred and Mary, a couple of our team members, maybe they've taken on a bunch of things and they only get halfway through it and they're not finished with stuff. I mean, that's the Scrum Master's problem to try and fix. Are we delivering value at the end of every sprint? And what method are we doing that, and can we do it better? If things are getting half done, doesn't mean that we're taking on too much in the planning process. Doesn't mean that we're not properly assessing how to translate the outcomes into technical activity, and we're underestimating how much work it takes in each sprint, whatever the case may be. Now, what's the product owner going to be reviewing through all of this? Well, they're going to be reviewing how well each sprint is leading towards the ultimate vision. How well is it progressing? What level of value is being accrued in each sprint? And how is the vision adapting to what's coming out of each sprint? Because we've talked already a fair bit about the review at the internal end of the sprint. Yeah, we're going to review what we did and how we did it, etc. And that's all vital stuff. But there's another parallel, different review discussion that the product owner would regularly have with the client. And it doesn't matter whether the client is some other department or some other internal division or it's an external paying customer. The point is that the product owner is going to be looking at the value of what gets created in each sprint and says, is this still what you need? Is this what you thought it was going to be? Is this accruing value? Can we, should we change it to something else for the future? Adaptation. Now, for a lot of plan-based methodologies and traditional project managers. The idea of partway through a project, walking up to the client and you say, is this still what you want, or do you want something completely different next week or next month? Yep, most of them would turn green and purple and quiver at the idea of doing that. But there are situations, there are kinds of projects where the customer starts with insufficient idea. Now, if you only have a waterfall methodology to work with, guess what happens with that kind of project? One of two things. Either the project never gets off the ground because nobody can sufficiently agree that there's a ironclad business case and a return on investment for this because they can't adequately define what they want, or they put a stake in the ground and say, oh, well, look, let's just think it's this. And it's not. And so the budget blows out and the schedule blows out and everything else blows up. And lots of people think it's a failed project. But actually what they might have got was a really good result, considering how little they knew about it at the beginning. So with Scrum, with Agile, we're saying, well, let's do this in a way that says every Scrum, every sprint review, we are deliberately working with the client to say, is this still the vision you want? Are we working towards that vision? Or have you learned something out of what we've just delivered for you that tells you that maybe you want something a little bit different? Doesn't mean the budget changes. Doesn't mean that the schedule changes. But every piece of work has an opportunity cost. So it might mean they turn around and say, well, we want more of this kind of thing, but we understand that that means you'll have to probably do less of the other thing that we thought we wanted. So, sprint principles. Here's a short list. Let's have a brief chat about them. Some of the core principles that we need to think about when working out our sprint, our iteration. What's it all about? Well, there is a really important element of team collaboration. Now, I've talked before about the team has to plan what's going to happen in a sprint. You know, they look at the product backlog and they say, well, yeah, we can do this, 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 and this. Now, I mentioned before that the product owner has already put some idea of thought into saying, well, this is probably what should happen in the first sprint. But, you know, they may not be right. There needs to be a collaborative process where the team says, well, you know, we just can't get all that done in our sprint of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. And so the content of what happens in a sprint is a collaborative, discussive process. And it needs to be planned in a way that says, well, we're going to make sure that we are only taking on board what we think we can get done. So that means that it's got to be long enough, the sprint needs to be long enough to make sure that completion can happen. Completion on incremental things, completion on stories, which I've alluded to, and we'll discuss a bit more in a moment. So these are the features, the capabilities, the perspectives of the outcomes that we're looking for. It's got to be long enough to actually complete them. There's no point having a sprint of 1 week when getting anything done is probably going to take a week and a half to do one thing. But they've got to be short enough that they can be reviewed and adapted and learned from. This is a really key point. You don't want to have a sprint period that's like 3 months for a sprint if that means that you lose sight of the lessons learned from what was done in month number 1. So short enough that you can get things done and completed so that you can then review them and get the feedback and feed that back into the next planning discussion. And if you're waiting another 6 or 8 weeks for that planning discussion, you're going to erode a lot of the value of what you're actually learning out of that process. But here's another thing that is really important to the sprint concept, and that is minimal interruptions during the sprint. Let them get on with the work. That is a core concept of Scrum. No distractions, no disturbances. Get on with it. It means that everyone knows what they should be doing, and it's a relatively short period of time. So if it turns out that they're working on the wrong thing in the wrong way, or there's a bit of an issue with that, you've got that end of period to stop and say, well, let's rethink this and do this differently. That's why it's so short. But there needs to be a lack of planning interruption to that period of time. So what that means is that we're not going back to these hardworking individuals and hardworking teams and saying, well, you know, I know you said you had that in the sprint this time. Let's can that. Let's pull that out and put this other thing in the sprint instead. And can you do that next week for me? That's not how the sprint works. The sprint should be locked in, and you get maximum efficiency of effort and continuity of concentration and outcome by minimizing interruptions. But what that means is that the review that happens in between the sprints is full on. You maximize the amount of review that happens and the amount of leverage that you gain from it in between, because you do none of it at that level during the sprint. What you do during the sprint is only the daily stand-up meetings. And the daily stand-up meetings, they are there just primarily to find the practical obstacles to getting on with what was committed to during that particular sprint. And I'll give you an example. Fred says, look, I'm meant to be doing this work today, but my login to that system isn't working. I can't do it. Well, glad we found that out this morning rather than on Friday afternoon. And that's what the stand-up meetings are for. Mary says, look, someone was meant to do this testing of this stuff, and I can't go back and do this other stuff because I haven't got the testing results yet. Right. Who's listening to all of this? The Scrum Master. Scrum Master is saying, right, Fred, I'll make sure that, Joe and whatever from tech support gets that sorted, and Mary, look, I'll make sure that we get someone else testing this stuff this afternoon so you can get that information. Whatever the answer is, that's the purpose of the stand-up meetings. Not to change what people are doing, but to fix the obstacles to productivity and continuity. Because the whole team is accountable. This is something we've alluded to. It is fundamental concept of Scrum. The whole team carries the burden. They need to be able to collaborate because they need to be able to commit, because they need to be held accountable collectively. Because there's no opportunity, there's no room in this process for little things that get left behind or people that get left behind. It all becomes highly obvious on a regular basis. And of course, the daily meetings, the daily stand-up meetings. We call them stand-up meetings because we don't want people sitting down getting comfortable. We don't necessarily want them sort of relaxing, taking too long, getting bored, texting their friends during the meeting. We don't do that, right? That doesn't happen in technology firms. But you know what I mean. We don't want lost productivity of people in a meeting that goes on so long that they don't know why they're there. Not what it's all about. Let's pause for some questions. Let me ask James first of all. Have you pinpointed, James, any really interesting questions that we should answer, or should I have a look at the stuff that's in our list here?
Hi, Brenton. We've got a few in the list here. I've flagged a few up the top of the list here. I don't know which ones you'd like to do now or later, but one of them just here is, where does the project manager role come in amongst the Scrum roles?
Good question. All right, let me tackle that one first, and I'll have a look through more of these questions and see if we can cover a few now before we have our last couple of slides, and then we'll cover the rest of the questions. So it's something that I probably should have elaborated on at the time when we're talking about roles. Now, we're talking about those roles that I mentioned in Scrum as functional roles, but the project manager is essentially a combination of these things. So you think about, what does the function of project management generally mean? There are two key elements to project management. One is planning and one is facilitation. So a lot of traditional project management means that we plan what needs to happen. And that means that we often supervise, manage, or do a lot of research and investigation into what information we need to pull into our planning process so that we can make good plans. So these functions are about gathering information, reviewing it, making decisions about what's going to happen. These are functions that still happen between the two roles of Scrum Master and Product Owner. Now, I mentioned facilitation. During the execution of the project, in a traditional waterfall project, a project manager is going to be responsible for making sure the plan is being carried out. So they're going to be making sure that things are facilitated, that obstacles are detected and overcome. And usually the heartbeat of that kind of information is the communications planning. So when I mentioned before about communications failure being one of the biggest causes of project failure, it's about the ability of the project manager to facilitate flow and facilitate efficiency, continuity, and the flow of results and work and output and outcomes. So if you parallel those objectives of what the project manager in a traditional project is trying to do, you translate those into both the product owner and the Scrum Master. So does this mean that in traditional projects you have a project manager who's ultimately responsible for anything, and then in Scrum you have two people that have to juggle this ball between them? Well, kind of, yes. But if you look at the other aspect of financial accountability that your typical project manager has, that lies with the product owner. So in Scrum, the product owner is generally responsible for the financial success of the vision and its value at the end. So whether or not you make money out of this, which is typically what we're all here to do, and whether or not it's financially viable and successful or business viable, that comes down to the product owner. So that aspect of accountability lies there. So what it means, though, is that we're separating the roles. It's not up to the product owner to worry on a daily basis exactly how things are being done. We've separated that out. So it's the two roles combined, but handled separately and recognized separately. Let me look at the other questions we've got here. We've got a question from Terry saying, in my organization, the Scrum Masters have 4 teams each and do 2-week sprints. Okay, so Scrum Masters end up being little more than meeting organizers. Is this okay? Well, they've gone on to say that consequently they are facilitators in the meeting and they don't seem to add any other value. Should this be changed, and if so, how? Well, it's a good question. I think that Scrum Masters, when there's 2 reasons for this sort of thing to happen. One is when things are going very well. If you have highly capable, highly collaborative teams, and if the meetings and what gets talked about in those meetings is highly fruitful, if you have little in the way of personality conflict, if you have proactive contribution from these meetings, it could be you have adequately successful teams or accustomed teams that are working well together, and that all the Scrum Master needs to do is keep things on track. It could also be, however, that the Scrum Masters themselves have become somewhat passive. Now, in my experience, passive Scrum Masters can be because they are people who perhaps aren't necessarily totally confident or familiar with exactly how all of this comes about. So not knowing all the different permutations of why Scrum works the way it does, some Scrum Masters without that can be a little bit reluctant to pipe up and say, well, you know what, you should consider this, or you should consider that, or you should do this differently. So it can be sometimes the training, familiarity, and confidence level of the Scrum Master that can contribute to all of that. So your question, is it okay? Well, it can be okay as long as what you're talking about is not a lack of focus, lack of results, lack of outcome. Now, it's the product owner's responsibility, because as I just mentioned, they're responsible for the financial success and the vision and its value. It's the product owner's responsibility to look at and say, well, hang on, these Scrum Masters we've got involved in all this sort of stuff, they're just, warming a seat, they're not really doing much, because the product owner and the Scrum Master to sit down at the end of each sprint and say, well, what happened, how do we do? Now, if that's a fairly boring, flat discussion, if the product owner is concerned that what's going on is due to a overly passive position by the Scrum Master, that's something that they need to address. That would be where that responsibility would lie. I would be wary of that situation going on for too long, because what can happen is people can function by habit. And the whole point of a Scrum Master is to shake things up. Habits are okay in some situations, but they're quite damaging in others. And so the Scrum Master's role is to challenge habits, to look at the information and say, how does this information challenge what we think we're doing or what we're comfortable doing? You can't live in comfort zones all the time with a proactive Scrum Master. They're constantly challenging things. So I would say that there's possible source of cause for concern in all of that, but not necessarily so. Hopefully that's a bit of an explanation. But let's look at another question from Stephen, and then we'll go and have a bit of a chat about user stories that will hopefully fill in some more gaps. So Stephen's asking, how do you handle when Scrum Masters or product owners want to perform reviews during a sprint period? I believe cloves of garlic are useful for keeping away vampires. You could try that. Generally, this happens in my experience because, like I just mentioned, not everyone involved in these roles is highly familiar with why it happens the way it happens. So if they're going to jump in and say, hey, let's have a review partway through, well, a couple of things can be. If the product owner wants to do that, then It's possibly because they're not confident in the sprint planning that was done. Maybe the sprint planning was underdone. Maybe it was poorly done. Maybe they don't have a lot of confidence in the Scrum Master to effectively deliver what was planned for at the end of that sprint. Maybe there's some conflict there where they're not sure how that's all going to work out. And so they like to get their fingers in and participate. Well, the product owner is not the Scrum Master. They need to be different people in most cases. So they generally, if there's not a strong working relationship and not a degree of trust, then you'll find a product owner butting in on the Scrum Master's activity. Is the Scrum, because the product owner is the one responsible for the product backlog, not the Scrum Master. So if you're in a situation, if you're talking about a situation where the people are actually looking to be doing different things than what was committed to at the beginning of the sprint, that's the product owner butting in as a role, because they are the ones that control the stuff that really should be in the next sprint. Why are they injecting it into this sprint? And this is where the Scrum Master, their role is to stand up and say, no, butt out of my sprint. We talked about this last week. We're locked in. You know, back in your chair or I'll get out the garlic. So this is where the relationship between the Scrum Master and the product owner is crucial and needs to be functional. And if it's a little bit uncomfortable or worse, then yes, you're in for a much more difficult time in completing your sprint. So if you are regularly interrupting your sprints with the kind of review and adaptation that should happen at the end of a sprint, one of two things. You either need to re-examine the period of time that you've set out as a sprint, and maybe it should be shorter. Maybe it really should be shorter. Or you're not really following the methodology at all sufficiently. You're breaking the intention of the methodology. And if you don't know exactly why you're doing that and exactly how you're going to make it work, then you're kind of guessing as a methodology and making it up as you go and working out what kind of, it might be responding to more about how people feel they should be doing and appeasing their emotional state rather than the methodology. Right, well, let's have a bit of a chat now about, I've only got a couple of slides left, so we're getting through it. I want to tell you a little bit more about user stories because they are pretty important in the scheme of what Scrum uses to actually build stuff. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that user stories, they are not specifications. They're not a list of tasks, and they're not generally very definitive because they are written from the user's point of view. They are an outcome, and sometimes they're not even that clear. If you get an example, I've already used this example and we've talked about it already. We've talked about a report of last year's sales figures. Now, that'd be great. Most companies would like to have one of those. Most companies already do, but for the sake of it, let's just say that they want a report of last year's sales figures as part of this project, as part of this software that's being built. Well, that's great. What does that look like from a technical point of view? Well, it's not. You're not going to get a user saying, well, you know, I need a database of this many fields and they're going to have to be this size and they're going to have these kind of restrictions on the field and it's going to have to be this kind of column width, etc. No, that's not a user story. It's a story because it's interpretive. So the user needs to define the result they get. Now, I mentioned last week when I introduced a little bit of what I do, that I've spent time, I have a business that does user experience design. And this business made a whole income and living out of the sitting in between the people that know how to do it and the people that think they know what they want. There is an enormous possibility for disconnect between the two. And what happens, and the reason this often happens with non-agile projects, is because all the interpretation happens inside a bubble. Yeah, they want a sales report from last year. Well, we're just going to make a bazillion assumptions about how that's going to look, and we're going to put that into the plan. And we're not going to check that assumption because in a plan-based methodology, we don't have an opportunity to check that unless we go through the exhaustive user reviews and figure out what tends to happen. Of course, it's the user acceptance phase. It's at the very end where the user says, well, that's not how I wanted it to look. That doesn't really help me because I need it to show me these figures to compare to these figures. Well, The waterfall project says, well, you didn't say that in the beginning, so we didn't give, well, yeah, but I thought it was implied. Well, this is the circular discussion that goes on. And by breaking these things down into user stories in this way and having the opportunity to say at the end of a very short period of time, okay, here's what we interpreted your user story to be. Yeah, we had a chat about it. And keeping in mind that when you tackle users with some poignant questions about what did you really mean when you asked for this report, and when you do that hour after hour, day after day, week after week at the early stages of a project, their brains dribble out their ears. It's difficult to go through that process in a condensed period of time. But you break it up over a period of the lifetime of the project, and you can regularly go to the people who wrote these user stories and say, now, exactly what did you mean by this bit? Oh, well, that bit's there. And you have an hour's discussion or 2 hours or whatever you need to do, and make sure you get that information. So it's an interpretation of a situation. What is the situation? The situation is a happy user staring at a screen with the information that they need to make the decisions that make their life great. That's the situation we're trying to describe. That's the situation that the user story tries to describe. Now, guess what you get when you have user stories and you have technical people trying to deliver that user story? Then they're trying to meet the expectations of the customer. They're trying to deliver the right user experience. And it's far more successful than trying to extrapolate that user experience in advance over the life of the project. So you have, they're often called features. And there's a little bit of a difference between a feature and a user story. A user story is about an outcome and a situation, and it has a certain value associated with it. So the user who wants their last year's sales reports, they will assign a certain value to that report. And the closer it meets their situation, the more value they'll give it. And if it's not meeting that, they have the opportunity through the iteration process to say, well, you know, that's great, but can you add one more column? Because I need this information as well. And they're the final judge. They're the only judge, really, because they wrote the user story. They know what they wanted. We know there's an area of interpretation. We know we're going to try and get that interpretation right, and if we don't, we'll fix it. And if they change their mind, we'll fix that too. I don't mean we'll fix their mind. I mean, we'll deliver what they now want. It's okay for them to suddenly wake up and say, you know, I really didn't need that because I've discovered something better. But the customer is the only person whose judgment of this matters. And this is where some slightly rogue product owners who aren't necessarily functioning effectively as the champion of all things customer can make things a little bit more difficult in a Scrum-based project. Here's a quote that I like from Orson Welles, a somewhat famous author. It says, if you want a happy ending, well, that depends, of course, on where you stop your story. You can convince yourself by stopping partway through the discussion that you've given the customer what they want. This happens. This tends to happen retrospectively in a lot of waterfall-based projects because really it's too late then. You know, if you haven't delivered exactly what they want, the only other option is to convince them that that's what they wanted all along. I've seen that happen. But in the Scrum methodology, in the Agile-based, the idea is to say, well, the story is going to stop when the customer is happy with the ending. But how do we do this on a large scale? It's okay to have this thing. We've got this idea now. We're saying, well, the feature, the user story, the sales report example that we've given, the customer's got their head around that and they like it. That's good. But how do we deal with that on a bigger scale, a bigger picture? Well, there's this issue called the release plan, and this sits firmly under the hat of the product owner. Now, the release plan, and here is a interesting example of a release plan, and it's the important points I want to pull out of this is that you'll notice along the top that there is sprint 1, sprint 2, and sprint N, which is however many sprints it's going to be. There is a number of sprints here. And you'll see that at the release planning at the beginning, you start with the backlog, and it says you get the whole system context, the vision, the big picture story, and you refine just enough to do the planning to get started. Now you've noticed at the bottom of there, the basic Scrum tenet, user value must be delivered in every sprint. You must be able to deliver something that they can measure. And if it's not complete and working, they can't measure it. Well, they can measure it, it's measured at 0. So in the beginning, you'll notice that the thing here listed as core architecture, which is the supporting structure of what needs to happen throughout the project, that's got a bigger chunk of time and effort up front. And we kind of alluded to this already, where you have things like in the software example, you might be building a database before you're building what goes into it. It's kind of, take a bridge, building a bridge analogy, you'll build the pylons before you put the deck on. So there are things that need to happen first, and those kinds of structural supporting architecture do need to happen up front. And this is part of your release planning. What should come in up front? And what should happen a bit later? Because it's going to be dependent upon things that have happened before it. You also, and this is a really important point, when you look at the comment here at the bottom of Sprint 2, it says you do your highest risk features up front, early. Maybe not Sprint 1, because you're still building infrastructure at that point. But you do them early because the earlier you get your high-risk stuff done, the earlier you get your feedback and the earlier that you can mitigate and do something different. So that's part of your key part of your risk mitigation strategy. Get the high-risk stuff on the plate early so you can respond, rather than if you do it later, if you do it too late, you might be running out of potential resources. Remember I said before, when the customer has the opportunity to say, look, I don't want this anymore, I want more of this because this is really good. Or maybe they do it the other way around. They say, look, I want more of that. What can we drop off our project to make room for it? Well, if you're at 95% the way through the project, what can you drop off the project to make room for that interesting thing? Or what can you drop off the project to deal with this high-risk outcome that's just giving you some alarm bells? Well, not much. And that's the whole point. You do it when you've got plenty of room to move and to modify and adapt. Now, what this release plan is meant to describe is at the end of all of this, you get a releasable set of capability, something that achieves something. What do I mean by capability? I'm going to draw a distinction, and I'm going to explain capability by comparing it to features and value. So what are features? Features are useful outcomes. A sales report of last year's sales, that's a useful outcome. It's also a feature. F1 for help, that's a useful feature. Well, what's a capability then? We define a capability as being a collection of useful features, but importantly, a collection of useful features that can be defined and segmented from something else. So an example would be a complete suite of sales reporting functions and features. A set of code and a set of features that says I can report on any product of any year and do any kind of this and that with my sales reports, and it's great. I can do all sorts of things. Well, that is a capability. It's a sales reporting capability in our example. Now, that might not be the end of the project. That might be only the small portion of what the entire project is, because the entire project might be a complete CRM system or even bigger. But that segmentable, sectionable piece of capability could be a shippable thing. We might say, well, look, here's the sales reporting stuff. We can give you that. You can start using that now whilst we continue to build the next interesting thing. So where does value fit in all of this? Well, it's essentially capability that has measurable merit. Now, you could say that for a customer, understanding what their last year's sales figures were or what all their sales figures were is pretty useful, pretty measurable. They'll like it, and they'll pretty much know how much they like it. But if it's a report that tells them what their staff members had for lunch each day on an average basis, not so valuable. Not unless they want to sell that to the cafeteria down the road. But the point is, it's capability that can have measurable merit, and that merit is where you have the point of recompense, remuneration, payment. the financial success of the project is based on the relative worth of the capability that you've created. And yeah, this is the kicker. If we're constantly looking at this and we're constantly focusing on this, then we're constantly delivering what the customer truly, really wants and what they will truly, really pay for. And what we're trying to do is avoid the otherwise argumentative approach that says, well, we've got to the end of the project and we've spent all this time and money and effort, and we've kind of had to modify it along the way because you weren't quite happy with everything, and now you're stuck with it, and that's it. Can we have our money now, please? And those are the kinds of projects that often made the news because they didn't quite deliver the value that everyone thought they would. I had a good friend of mine that talked about a story in a fairly large government department, which shall remain nameless, who talked about a piece of software project that began about 3 years before with, I think, an $800,000 budget. 3 years later, $3.5 million later, it was canned, delivering nothing. It wasn't done using Agile. Not to say that that's the reason for that, of course, but we know of those stories and how they work and how they come out. So let's have another look at some of the questions we have, any new questions that have come in. And before we wrap up tonight, I'll just check with James in a little while to see if there's any admin questions that might have come in as well that we do need to address and tackle if any of them haven't been, or many people had the same question. But first of all, let's look at some of the questions that we've got coming up here. I've got a question here that says, how does Scrum work with geographically dispersed teams? Well, if you read most of what Scrum talks about, it will suggest that it works poorly with geographically dispersed teams. But the point is, Scrum teams need to have periods of intense collaboration. So you need to be able to facilitate that and don't pay lip service to that. So what I mean is, obviously in geographically dispersed teams, you can't just fly people all over the country every day for a planning meeting. It doesn't mean you won't fly anybody, but it means that if you're going to take advantage, and there are advantages, I mean, if you wouldn't be talking about it if there weren't advantages, of a geographically dispersed team, then make the investment in making the planning collaboration easy. Now, what that might mean is that you deliberately second people from one team into another, so that if you have cultural differences between teams, for example, you have a member of that team working in the same room as a member of another team who have displaced their person into the other team, so that there's this cultural understanding. When one team is saying, well, this other team over there, why don't they do this way? And your swap out student exchange, a person exchange member can turn around and say, well, that's because of this, this, and this. Those sorts of things are highly valuable to consider when they're appropriate. But probably the most important is to make sure that you have the opportunity, the facilities, and the intention to have inexcusable, intense communication and collaboration during planning. That includes during the stand-up. Now, I've done countless hours in Skype meetings over the years, and I can tell you that it's sometimes pretty difficult to be on the end of the Skype call in a face-to-face meeting, trying to join in and trying to listen to all the background noise and pick out the voices, etc. It can be hard, and it can be extremely hard if the internet connection is poor, the voice microphone equipment is poor, and a few other things like that. And in my experience, just that little bit of extra effort in trying to smooth out some of those wrinkles can actually have a profound effect on the degree of collaboration and therefore the degree of value and outcome that a geographically dispersed team can accomplish. So let's not look at the fact that they're geographically dispersed as being the real problem. Let's look at what symptoms that leads to and deal with them. And you'll find that you can still deliver good results with geographically dispersed teams. Now, I had a project once where I had a customer in Dallas. I was coordinating a project. I was doing some game design for a company based in Dallas who had all the IP, the intellectual property content. They'd outsourced this to a software company in California that were coordinating all of that. The work was actually being done in Sri Lanka by a team of coders and software people in Sri Lanka, and I was based in Sydney at the time doing the game design itself. So, and we had artists that were doing graphical design based in London. Yeah, it was challenging, but we just had to make sure that we used the tools that we had to share the information. Because as I've said before, if you're not sharing the information, having the reviews, and leveraging. If you can't do those things, then get a bigger hammer and knock down the things that make that hard and make that work. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do justice to the processes you've adopted. Let's look at a question from William saying, how does Scrum handle part-time or peripheral contributors to the project? E.g., a software project may require legal managers' input to some sort of contracts and marketing managers' input. So you're talking about peripheral people that may, from time to time, need to contribute into a project that is busy and intently working in an Agile process. So William's saying, would they be part of the team, or would their inputs be coordinated in conjunction with the team? A couple of different ways of answering this problem. If they are someone who doesn't and might not be expected to know how to exactly function as a team member in an Agile context, then you can have a chaperone. And I've used this method successfully a couple of times, where you've had external experts where you don't burden them with the responsibility of methodology. An external person who has a chaperone is essentially hooked up with someone as their main point of liaison and flow. Now, that doesn't mean that they pass all their information on to that one person and that one person is responsible. No, it's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they are a mini Scrum Master for that particular resource, or maybe for a couple of resources. Maybe if you have 2 or 3 and there's not too many, and you have someone who's, you know, always loves to sit in on all the Scrum Master stuff and has an interest in that, maybe they're the right kind of person to be a mini Scrum Master for the external resources. Maybe not. Maybe the Scrum Master just needs to make sure, in doing their role of Scrum Mastering, to make sure that those external parties know how to function and know how the team functions. So there's a couple of different ways of going about it. What you can't really afford to do is assume it'll work and not worry too much about how they integrate with your methodology. There be dragons in that method. So definitely make some effort to make sure that there is a way of helping them participate, and B, having a backstop to help them and you know when that might not be working out. Another question from Andre saying, typically Scrum meetings are kept short. How are complex issues that require a lot of discussion managed? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, focus on why Scrum meetings are short. And I'm assuming for this discussion that you're talking about the daily stand-up meetings. And I'm assuming also that you're talking about complex issues that might be hard to resolve, obstacles that really are obstacles to people's work that might be difficult to resolve. Well, the first thing is that let's be clear that the reason we're holding short stand-up meetings is so that we don't waste everybody else's time with one person's problem. So first thing is, you might be better off tackling something on a smaller scale outside of the Scrum meeting. The Scrum daily meeting is the place to flag it, where someone says, I have a nightmare of a problem getting anything done, yada, yada, yada. Well, wow, okay, that's big. Let's take that discussion as soon as we finish the Scrum meeting. Have your Scrum meeting, everyone else has their issues, we fix a few, we don't fix a few, and then we have the Scrum Master, whose job it is to fix all these, might sit down with the individual or a couple of people and say, right, let's talk about this. Let's get into detail. Because if they are really stymied and their work and effort is compromised, then they're going to be able to find the time and resources to spend on getting involved to fix it. And that's exactly what the Scrum Master is there to do anyway. Just take it offline and take it outside of the Scrum meeting if it needs to be that complex. Just make sure you're not wasting everyone else's time with the time it might take to solve that complex issue. But of course, it still needs to be solved. So you're still going to spend some time on it somewhere on the way.
Hi, Brenton. It's James here. I'll just butt in with a few questions I've sort of put into one all along the same topic, if you like.
Sure.
A few questions about Scrum team sizes. What's the minimum team size, and is there such thing as a team size that's too big?
Yes, there is such a thing. And most Scrum practitioners will typically tell you that anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen is considered a good number. Now, there's going to be obviously some relevant factors based on what the work they do, their industry, how familiar they are with working together, and a few things like that. So there's always going to be factors. There's no hard and fast rule, but anything more than half a dozen, sorry, anything less than half a dozen, and they become too small to be collaborative. Remember that your team needs to be able to share information. You want to have a collaborative review process. Pardon me. So you want to have enough people together working together. You don't want to break up and have 20 teams of 3 people. that would create a communication matrix that could be a bit of a nightmare, and unnecessarily so. How big should a team be? Well, most people will tell you that once you start to go above 10 or 12 people, you start to get into situations where people will naturally function in discrete coordinations within that group. So if you have 20 people in your team, you will look at that team, and in most situations, you will find 2 or 3 natural organic groupings that will form out of that. Because as social beings, we don't tend to interact well with such a large number of people as a team. We don't think of it that way. This is why when you look at all the sports that exist, pardon me, when you look at all the sports that exist out there, what team numbers do they tend to come up with? You know, they tend to be somewhere between 11 and 15. And, you know, for some sports, 15 is a lot. So there is a human dynamic and a reason why teams in sports are at a certain range group. Think about that and think about why, and have a very good reason why you think that's a silly idea and you've got a better idea as to how a team should be built, because there are fundamental elements as to why. So in most cases, 6 to 12 would be my suggestion, and be really clear on why you're going to go different from that if you choose to. I mentioned, the question came up before about geographically dispersed teams. I mean, you've got the situation where you could have people working by themselves, but that doesn't mean that if they're sitting at home or working from home or something like that, that they're not part of a team. They should still be part of a particular team that they're involved in, and that team should do their best to feel like a team and be a team. James, you got any more of those good questions?
Yeah, along similar lines about the Scrum team makeup, can a Scrum Master be the member of the team as well?
So can they be a production member of the team as well? Well, in some organisations where the project size and the project budget is relatively small, that's a necessity. I have seen that happen where you just don't have the luxury of having someone say, look, you know, you don't need to do anything else but be Scrum Master. So sometimes you do, other times, yeah, they have to be otherwise productive. And yes, they can and may well be, but you've got this enormous conflict that arises, and it must be managed very carefully, and it can be very problematic. If a person is a Scrum Master and a member of the team and a productive worker, if that's what happens because it's a small business or it's a small team, etc., be very clear on what is the more important of those two roles. And in my view, Scrum Mastering always comes first, because the role of Scrum Master is the leveraging force of making sure that everyone else is delivering. And if that becomes second best, then what are we doing? We're saying, well, that person is putting their own output above their responsibility to everyone else's output. It can't happen that way. So the organization and the product owner must understand that the first priority of that person is their role as Scrum Master. And that means that, yeah, they need to be very careful of making sure they have enough time to do that function properly in any given sprint and in between sprints. And if they take on a different additional production work during the sprint, it needs to be mitigated by that factor. Not impossible. Most purists of Scrum would say, look, not a good idea. But, you know, the realities of small business means that, you know, bad ideas can be made good. Any others, James?
Yep, another one here is whose responsibility is it to translate user stories and decide what will be developed?
The simple answer is it's everybody's, but the core of the answer is to say that, first of all, the interpretation of the user story into what's going to get done is a combination of the team members that are actually going to be doing it, the product owner to make sure that it is done and that it is interpreted from what information they have, and the Scrum Master to make sure that it is done correctly. So the interpretation is an important part of the sprint planning process, but there is an important part of it that is the commitment element or the buy-in element, because we've talked before about the fact that it's got to be completable. It's got to be something that the team or the team members involved can commit to getting done by the end of the sprint. So they have the ultimate responsibility for that interpretation of whatever it is that they are working on, because they are the ones that are committing to deliver the outcome, the feature, the value, the capability by the end of that sprint. So they are always ultimately responsible for making sure they interpret that user story. However, at the higher level, the product owner is ultimately responsible for the accumulated value, which means they are responsible for all of these interpretations from a holistic point of view. They are responsible to make sure that if there are problems with interpretation, lingering problems or recurring problems or issues where it's consistently becoming a problem, that's something the product owner needs to get involved and fix, because that's what's going to impact the accumulated value. He's going to continually to accumulate less value than they are planning for if there's interpretation weaknesses. So who does the interpretation? Primarily the team members involved. And again, because the whole team is responsible, the whole team gets involved in a lot of these. So it's not a case of, Fred looks at Fred's user stories and said, right, I know how to do this, and Mary looks at her user stories and said, well, I know how to do these. The whole team is discussing all of this. And Frank and Joanna over the corner might be saying, no, hang on, Fred's working on that stuff. Wouldn't Joanna be better working on that? And these kind of discussions go on during the sprint planning meeting. So no one gets to sit out of that responsibility. I've sent another couple of questions. I'll just grab those two, James, before we cover anything else. I've got a question here that I've seen from Elizabeth saying, what do you do when the product owner does have a very specific features and specifications in mind? Well, Elizabeth, it depends on why they have a very specific feature, because I've seen product owners who have a very deep understanding of exactly what the customer is looking for. And sometimes that's because, and I saw a very good example of this, where the product owner, they had a background and a history and a knowledge that's inside the industry that their customer, their client worked in. So that product owner intimately understood what it was like to work with the outcomes and the value that were being created. They had a tremendous advantage in helping the team interpret and understand exactly what needed to be done. That was a good thing, and it was leveraged. But of course, you have those opportunities for people to think they're a little more clever in that regard than they perhaps truly are. And the important point to remember is that there is only one final arbiter, and that is the customer. And the product owner is accountable to the customer. Now that translates internally where the team and what it creates is ostensibly accountable to the product owner, in the sense that the product owner is representative of the customer, but it's still the customer making the final choice. So if you have a situation where a product owner has good inside knowledge and is assisting the team with these very specific interpretations of exactly what's being required, and that's a good thing, then great. I suspect what you might be referring to is, what do you do when that's not quite working out? Given that there's very few other roles involved, you would probably, as if you're a team member, you'd be addressing this with the Scrum Master and saying that we're seeing challenges with interpretation because we're not convinced that the specificity that is being ordained by the product owner is in agreement with the feedback we're getting from the customer. Now, the Scrum Master can make sure that the full extent of customer feedback must come back to the team, must be available to the team. It's not necessarily useful or good for the product owner to be this insulating shield wall in between the team and the customer feedback and provide 100% of the interpretation. That's not how it should work. It doesn't mean that everyone sits down in the one room all the time, but it means that the kind of information and feedback should be shared. It's got to be facilitating good decisions. And so sometimes by making sure that that information is a little more public and a little more shared, you can more easily see that there might be alignment issues. But when it's all said and done, it's generally the product owner's responsibility to make sure that what gets delivered is what the customer's happy with and what gets paid for. At some point upstream, that product owner is accountable to someone else for their role and function. And ultimately, it's that person that needs to be satisfied that the product owner is actually functioning as a good product owner. And whether or not they might need a little bit of extra guidance and training on that, or whatever. So hopefully that helps add to the picture. It's a difficult situation. I mean, what you're essentially saying is what happens when the people in charge aren't doing their job properly? That's a difficult question to answer because it's very circumstantial. Let's take a couple more. I've got a couple of questions from Peter. Can an Agile team operate as part of a program? Well, often they have to. Obviously, an Agile-based program is going to look very different from what the PMI program Body of Knowledge would look like, for example. But yeah, kind of not. You still have project management office. You still have a lot of the concepts of the aggregation of resources. You still have a lot of the fundamentals that apply in the strategic management of projects, because some of the core principles of program management in the management of individual projects that go towards a accumulated value. You think of it in the same way, but at a higher level. In the same way that we talked about multiple sprints, each sprint completing value and outcomes, which then combine together to form a release, which combine together to form a project or a releasable product, which combines together in a program of such products to create something even bigger. It's just one more layer. It can be that simple. There is something called a governance layer, and this is tapping into some of the things that are in the core principles of Agile that perhaps not easy for us to go to in today, but there is some specific ways that it would get handled, but certainly it should not be considered difficult or scary to do because it is just that extra layer. James, do you have any others that we should be dealing with, or should we be wrapping up for everyone tonight?
I guess we officially end at 9:30, so perhaps we should ask that any further questions. And I'm sorry, there's a lot more questions we couldn't get to, so I'm sorry if your question couldn't be answered. If people could post them on the forum as usual, and we can get a good discussion going.
I just want to reiterate also for everyone that just because we didn't answer your question tonight, and we've often get a lot more questions on the week too because people get their teeth into the discussion, etc. As I've mentioned to a couple of times already, after week 3, we will look at the unanswered questions that we've accumulated, and we will put together, if we need to, if we can't cover them or we don't think we've covered them, we'll put together a separate recording which is just me answering the questions, and that'll be downloadable, and you'll be able to find your question in the list and pull out the answer that you're looking for. That's assuming that you haven't already got it off the forums or somewhere else. So don't feel that just because we're not answering your questions live in the webinar that you're going to get ignored. It's not the case. We don't want anyone or any question to miss out if we can avoid it. So we are still planning to do that. So please do keep your questions coming. Don't be disheartened next week when we tune in. We're going to talk at length about lean next week, which I'm sure most of you are anticipating. Keep your questions coming then, even if it's about Scrum, etc. So we probably won't answer Scrum questions next week because we're going to focus on lean, but we will keep them and we will do our best to answer them. So just before we wrap up tonight, I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't already, do check out the online portal. Do tune into the forums. Even if you don't have a question to ask, have a look at what other people are asking. You might have an answer or an opinion or a suggestion. Do listen to the recordings. They will be up there typically by Monday at the latest, and they're only really brief. So even if you just listen to them once if you can to get yourself a head start on what's being talked about. And of course, tune into the webinar next week, and hopefully you'll be able to enjoy what we cover and going through that in some detail. Now, just before we sign off, James, was there any administration questions that came up that you want to mention?
Actually, there weren't. I was pretty impressed. There was just one at the start, and I put the link to the portal, learn.itmasters.edu.au. No others.
All right. Well, in that case, we'll wrap up for tonight. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks for the wealth of questions. Great to see everyone involved and interested. Again, sorry we couldn't answer them all. And I apologize if I over-answered a lot of these questions, but I'm trying to be thorough with all of them because hopefully with every one question that's come up, there's 3 or 4 people that have tried or thought of asking the same question. So we do try to be detailed about these sort of things. But anyway, thanks very much for tuning in. We look forward to talking to you again next week. Until then, thank you and good night.